Welcome all. This year's event will follow by complete accident last year's event, as you can probably tell by the amazingly odd and very morally uplifting title. Disclaimer, be tested on, and like last year, we actually have a disclaimer or two from the father of well-known sayings, Yogi Berra. He who is responsible for it's not over till it's over, and when you reach a fork in the road, take it. But the two that are relevant to us are the future still ain't what it used to be, and more importantly, it's still tough to make predictions, especially about the future. This book by well-known economist and hedge fund manager Michael Lewitt was sent to me by a client of mine that had owned it for a year and couldn't get past page 20. It's a little dense. As you can tell by the title, it's not what you'd call a lot of fun. But Michael Lewitt has got very good history in that he predicted not only the GFC but also the 01-02 crashes and made money off both of them. And when he wrote this book in 2006, he felt that the situation is more ripe now for a collapse than it was in either of those situations. And if you remember last year, where the presentation could really be summarised with this: could you bring in that list of risk factors you downloaded yesterday? And the answer from his PA was, it's still downloading. And a year later, it's still downloading. And the reality is that risk is almost always hidden in plain sight. The guy there under the truck, propped up by a couple of sticks, quite clearly bad things could happen and probably will. The thing is, it's very difficult to time catastrophe. And as you can see from this, it applies to the markets as well. He's holding a piece of dynamite that's been lit called the markets, and his friend is saying, yeah, not much happens at first. That's where we are today. So, what is on the menu? The real world. From the GFC till now, but only in a couple of slides. The economy from the GFC to today. A lot more slides. The GFC, why it happened, why it should have been obvious, what it taught us, and how we fixed everything. The state of the economy today as a result, a little bit on the D word, and by a little bit I'm using little in the same way as you use it in the sentence, Mount Everest is a little bit bigger than Mount Wellington. The markets since the GFC, especially since Brexit, you could almost argue it's a case study in what happens when you're addicted to drugs, can't possibly get off them. And then portfolio construction 102. What we do, in a beautiful slide full of colour, a bit of a look at 2018 and things that we're looking at the moment. So, the real world since Brexit. Populism is rampant everywhere and basically every continent, at both ends of the political spectrum. The thing about the political spectrum, for those of you that have read the two cows approach to the analysis of political systems, might remember this. Fascism is defined as you have two cows. The government takes both, hires you to take care of them, and then sells you the milk. Whereas communism, which is at the absolute opposite end of the political spectrum, you have two cows, you have to take care of them, but the government takes all the milk. You could argue that's pretty similar, which is probably why they both finish up with dictatorship. You have two cows, the government takes them both, shoots you. So economically, where are we? Potentially in the worst shape the world has been in since the 30s, and you could make a case for saying it's in the worst shape it has ever been in. Certainly the most perilous. Socially, it's absolutely dislocated and bifurcated down almost any axis you care to think of. The US is the poster child for that. It's bifurcated have, not. It's bifurcated East Coast, West Coast, North and South, the coasts versus the middle, the religious versus the non-religious, the haves versus the have-nots. It's astonishing. And Australia's not far behind. The UK is not far behind that. New Zealand is probably one of the few places in the world that isn't quite as screwed up as everywhere else. Climatically, well, I think we all know that. So the capital markets, I think we can be pretty sure that they're going to be affected by that. And personal assets are probably going to be a victim of all of this. So, I bang on and have banged on for years about the problem of inequality. We've done the Credit Suisse studies several times. I'm going to get it over and done with pretty quickly today, but the reality is that inequality is probably the biggest problem the world's got, certainly the West has got. There's a pretty good illustration. This is the share of wealth of the top 1% of US households since 1963, when they owned just under a quarter of the assets, to now when they own over a third of all the assets, 1%. At the same time, real incomes have fallen by 3% since the GFC in the bottom quintile. And the wealth effects of quantitative easing have accentuated this inequality, plus cheap capital, as I will bang on and on and on about today, has disrupted the labour market. So, does anybody actually remember the GFC? What caused it? Pretty obvious. Everybody remembers these guys. The ninjas. Not them or them, but no income, no job, no asset loans. It's what everybody will tell you. That low doc loans are the problem for everybody. And that's what created the issue. Covenant-light loans. 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, having a smoke. The boss, Pestilence, says, bad news, we've been made redundant, we've been replaced by the American subprime sector. And it's generally still accepted that that's why the GFC arose. And yet American subprime loans accounted for 12%. That's all of American debt, of American mortgage debt. So what really caused it? The D word. Debt, debt, debt. A love story. We loved it then, but it almost killed us. So what did we do? We loaded up on more. It's extraordinary. It's just nuts. In every single part of the economy around the world, we went from, here's 2008, here's today. 2008, we're 250% of world GDP. World GDP has grown. And the amount of debt to GDP has grown faster. And way back in 2012, this is a slide from our 2012 show, we knew it was a problem back then. So the 3 big Western blocs had between them 8 trillion of US in debt then, and that was considered a catastrophe that had to be fixed. And those beautiful people in the central banks saved us. Here's 2008. You might notice in 2008 that the 4 big central banks of the world, the Chinese, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Japan had around about 8 trillion of debt between them. They now have 19 trillion. This here is the Bank of Japan. So they were late to the party. Japan is easily the smallest of these 4 blocks, and yet that's how much they've taken on. The US, biggest jump, started to tail off. That's called quantitative tightening. It really is an amazing chart. It really is. So what about looking at a few specific examples? US, total federal debt in the United States of America is $21 trillion. Now, a trillion is a million million. A million million. They have 21 of them. But there's not just federal debt. There's the private sector. These are the banks. They've actually paid down almost 50% of the debt that they had. So the banks in the US are now remarkably strong. It's extraordinary. That part of the recovery actually worked. In here are the households, and the American households actually paid some debt down. Down here is business. Now, business hasn't. And US corporate debt is a very, very, very interesting thing. It's at an all-time high. It's roughly 3/4 of GDP. And the thing about corporate debt in the US is it's in all sorts of different bits. The most interesting one of which is corporate bonds. Now, everybody has corporate bonds. It's a huge part of world GDP. Corporate bonds in the world now account for more than 1/3 of global GDP. Corporate debt, more than 1/3 of global GDP. 60% odd of that number, so almost 1/4, is in corporate bonds. It's a huge market in the US. Last year, there were $54 billion raised by American companies on the share markets for IPOs, so initial public offerings. On bonds, it was $1.6 trillion. Now, 1.6 trillion is around about 30 times the amount that was raised in equity. That's all new debt. And the S&P 500 is worth around about 22 trillion. The Barclays US Aggregate Corporate Bond Index, so this is one form of debt, is 15 trillion. But it's growing like a weed. So if you look at this, last year it raised more than 10% of its previous value in 1 year. And the funny thing about this corporate debt is that most of what's been raised is crap. So here's 2008. Here's total corporate bonds in the US. This is just bonds. This isn't other forms of debt. As you can see, the light blue was a small proportion of a small number, comparatively. This down here, the very little line, the black line, is AAA debt. That's the best debt you can have. And it disappeared for a while because AAA companies more or less disappeared for a while. They made a bit of a comeback. The purple one is called AA debt, still very good. This one's called A debt. And the one that was little up here, the light blue one, which is now half of the total of all investment grade bonds, is BBB. Now, BBB might not mean much to people, except that occasionally you hear about it going blah, but it is quite important. It's the lowest tier of investment grade debt. One click down goes to double B, logically. Double B is pronounced junk. So double B and B, junk. And in the good old days, way back in 2008, it was a tiny proportion of the debt. The total amount of debt has grown, and rather than being 15 to 20% of the debt then, it's now more than half. One click away from dust. And the alarming thing is that this stuff is growing. So triple B has grown since the GFC by 200%. There's 3 times as much triple B debt now as there was coming into the GFC. That's this down here. Investment grade debt has actually doubled. It's gone up by 100%. So this is AAA, AA and A. And this stuff down here is what's called high yield. This is junk. And it's almost doubled. And then there's a thing called leveraged loans. These are loans that are they're right at the bottom of the heap. There's very, very, very little strength behind these things. It's up 150%. It's 2.5 times as much now as there was when we got wiped out. And this means we have a type of risk called fallen angel. Now, fallen angel sounds lovely. It's just gorgeous, right? So this is the rise of triple B debt. Now, you might notice something here. As things got tough in 2007, the amount of triple B debt fell. That's because it stopped being triple B debt. It either got downgraded or they went broke. Now, the issue with triple B is if it does get downgraded, it's no longer investment grade. And there's an interesting sort of investor called a passive investor that owns well over 80% of all investment grade bonds in the world robotically. And their mandate is they can only own investment grade debt. So if, let's say, 10% of this triple B stuff gets downgraded, these passive funds the following day have to sell immediately, which is interesting because if they sell, they'll be selling at a huge discount, and if there's a lot of it coming onto the market, which there will be, the price they get for it will be very low indeed. And the lucky people investing in these funds, and most people nowadays invest in passive funds, will get their heads handed to them. Half of US corporate bond market is now at this lowest level. That's the good news. These are leveraged loans. Now, the way that you judge the quality of a leveraged loan is by a thing called debt to EBITDA. Now, EBITDA is either earnings before I tricked the auditor, which is actually what it means, or earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization. What it means is revenue after direct costs. Now, these are beautiful colours. The blue colour is where the debt to EBITDA of the company that's been loaned to is less than 4 times revenue, the size of the debt. The green and the black up here, where are we, where's 2008, is this stuff. So that's 6 times and 7 times revenue. So in 2008, you can see that around about 60 to 65% of all these leveraged loans were at the highest level, only 4 times revenue. And only about 15%, 10 to 15% were at the worst level. Go along here. At the worst level, we're now up to north of 30%. 6 to 7 times revenue, and less than 20% are of the best quality or the least worst quality. And guess what? There's a few signs out there. There's some excesses in the credit market at the moment. For instance, in 2017, you got paid less for owning a US 10-year Treasury than you did, more for owning a US 10-year Treasury than you did for buying European junk bond. In other words, you get 3%, give or take, for your US 10-year. You get less than 2.5% for junk. That doesn't make any sense. Moody's, bless their hearts, tell us last year that covenant quality hits record low. Remember, we've had 2007, 2008 where it was a record low. And Veolia is not a little French company, a little French multinational, lovely, but it managed to get away with issuing a 3-year bond with a negative yield. That means you gave it $1,000 and they promised to look after your money and give you back about $950 after 3 years. That's nonsense. And guess what? Compensation for credit risk has diminished. So this green line down here is cash. So you'd only take on something like a corporate bond because it was paying you considerably more than what you were getting from cash, right? So back here, you're getting paid 3% more than you were for cash because cash you were getting nothing and the bonds were 3%. The bonds are still 3%, but cash is now 2.4, 2.5. You're only getting a much smaller amount of profit. And this here, these lovely bars, tell you that the price of these things is moving around dramatically. So the volatility of the returns you're getting on these bonds is huge. So not only is your yield falling, the difference, your profit over cash falling, but you're investing in something that's moving all over the place in value. But funnily enough, the sell-off in the fourth quarter last year wasn't just because of fundamentals. It's because this is what had happened to cash. So after the GFC, cash yields went from 5 to nothing. And now they've gone up again. But the credit fundamentals are rubbish as well. So in the last cycle, 2007, the amount of bonds that had been issued were up 71% over the cycle. This time they're up 140%. So there's far more bonds. Anybody's been looking to invest in them. The leverage in 2007 was only 1.7 times. It's now 2.4 times. So this here is around about a 60% loan. This is an 80-something% loan. Interest coverage looks as though it's got better, except here you're paying 5% or more. Here you're paying much, much less. So even though you're paying a far lower level of interest rate, your coverage is still around about the same as it was back then. As the interest rates go up, this gets worse. So, cyclically, we're seeing weakening credit fundamentals, growing falling angel risk, more credit spread volatility, more interest rate risk. So you're getting more risk. And are you getting more return? No. You're actually getting more risk and less return. But there's another more arcane risk that's developed. And that is what's called liquidity risk. Now here's the thing. What they're talking about here is that the level of trading on these things has got lower since the crash, despite the fact that these bonds have been bought by everybody. So the bonds are in a bull market in terms of the ability to get sold, and yet the liquidity on these things got worse and worse. And you have to trade these things through investment banks. So back in 2008, look at the capacity they had to trade these things versus the capacity they don't have now. Beware labels, as we will see in a minute. Everybody knows that bonds diversify risk. Anybody in finance will tell you that. So that's good news, except that it's crap. So this here is the correlation between equity risk and the credit spread risk of bonds. Now, to put this in perspective, 0.4, you can diversify a portfolio of Western shares by putting in frontier market shares. The correlation between frontier market shares and developed market shares is only 0.4. The correlation between this credit and equity markets is between 0.7 and 0.9. You're basically buying equity risk without any possibility of equity return. And when perception visits reality, and you're waiting to get saved because your equities have crapped out and you know your bonds are going to help you, you're like these guys. The guy on the left marooned on the island goes, "Yay, I'm saved," because there's a guy coming towards him on a canoe going, "Yay, I'm saved." You've actually doubled down on your risk. And here's the absolute killer. You might remember in the fourth quarter of last year that equity markets blew up. Bonds actually caused most of that volatility. US stock markets suffered their biggest loss of the Trump presidency on Friday, following bonds lower. Global bond sell-off drags down stocks. A rare and worrisome thing, only if you've never read anything in finance, happened during Wednesday's stock market slaughter. Bonds fell too. And then at the bottom, something we'll come back to a bit later, the stock market now really hates Fed Chairman Jerome Powell. So let's go back to debt, per se. You might remember the 21 trillion number for total federal debt in the US. That's actually 105% of GDP. That's one sort of debt. China makes that look somewhat conservative. Yes, that would be a pretty good analysis. In 2008, it was 160% of GDP, so China's done something nobody else in the world has ever done, and that is they've increased their level of government debt by 1 turn of GDP and done it in 10 years, which isn't bad. So I wonder what their corporate debt situation looks like. More or less the same. So corporate debt's 160% of GDP. So if you're quite good at maths, you can do 16 plus 26, you'll see that between corporate debt and government debt, 420% of GDP. And back in 2008, it was only 100% of GDP. And the Chinese just can't help themselves. Back in 2008, the amount of credit creation in China was this much, which was less than $1 trillion a year, and was a tiny proportion of the total amount, around about 16 or 17%. This is China debt creation today. It's 70% of all credit created in the world. What about Japan? Well, Japan, believe it or not, has got 240% of their GDP as government debt. The difference between the Japanese and essentially everybody else, however, is almost all of their debt is owned by Japanese, and offshore they are easily the world's biggest creditor. They own everybody's debt. So while Japan is moribund because of this debt, they could, if they really wanted to, sell everything they owned overseas and retire happily, more or less. Italy, however, is slightly different. Now, why is Italy important? It's the third biggest bond market in the world. That's a fact. And it's only 130% of debt. However, they're nobody's creditor. They owe money to everybody. Almost all their bonds are owned either by foreigners or by the ECB. And they're permanently in recession, essentially. Again, going back to 2012, a slide we used back then. It's amazing how many things stay the same. So this is how the world saw Southern Europe back in 2012. The Spanish have actually done a Herculean job and haven't been in recession since. These guys still make pasta and are still broke. Which leads us on to the Eurozone per se. Again, very colourful. Now down here, red is Italy. Not good. And green is Spain. Not good. In fact, green, the Spanish were in recession for longer than the Italians back then. But if you look over here, Spain has thrived since. Italy hasn't. And the other one to look for is Germany. Germany rules most things, and even they had a period in recession. And if you look along here, they've dabbled in it a couple of times. And in fact, you can't even see a yellow line for the December quarter, and the reason is everybody thought they were going to have a recession and somehow managed to report a 0.1% increase in GDP. If it had been negative, they would have had another recession. But Germans don't like being the bad guy in Europe. But they are a one-trick pony. This is why Europe's struggling. The Chinese aren't buying their cars at the moment. Back here, when Europe boomed quite unexpectedly in 2017, the Chinese would buy anything anybody offered them. And Germany is generally considered to be a very good barometer for global growth. They are, on some measures, still the world's biggest exporter. If they're not the biggest, they're the second biggest. And this is what's happened to them. This is where they halcyon days as they recovered. And now for something completely different, Australia. Look at this. This is Australian mortgage debt. Australian mortgage debt will go through 100% of GDP either the quarter we've just finished or this quarter. It used to be negligible. But here, when Basel I first came in, the Australian banks gave up on, they used to lend 70% to businesses, 30% on property, of which around about 70% of the property was to residential. They now lend 80% to residential property. And we might talk about what that means a bit later on, as in right now. Housing markets around the globe. This here is Toronto. And like a lot of these guys over here, Toronto, Vancouver, etc., had a very, very, very good run. Much better than Australia and New Zealand until quite recently. They've fallen off the cliff. Vancouver's even more startling than that. Australia, and New Zealand, Australia at the moment, New Zealand starting, are in trouble. That was a headline in this morning's Herald. Sydney's just had another hugely down quarter. And the UBS are saying for Australia it just started. They see, they published a piece in January where they said Melbourne and Sydney minimum of another 20% to go. I wrote to a colleague of mine in UBS and asked him to find out what he thought about New Zealand. He said New Zealand still has to go through the first stage before it has 20% down to go. And the thing about housing bubbles is that they create a mess. And this is a very, very, very odd slide. And that's because this number, this y-axis over here, is going from a high number to a low number. This one is a standard axis. This one is household savings rates. So at the moment, we're seeing something very unusual because traditionally, house prices contract and then household savings increases. And the reason for that is you feel less wealthy if the value of your house is going down, so you stop spending, which means you save, okay? In Australia at the moment, house prices clearly gone down, household savings still going down. Now, one of the reasons you'll see everywhere that the Reserve Bank of Australia is likely to cut twice in the next couple of months is because they want this to stop. They want people to start to feel better about their lives because they know that if they don't cut interest rates, people will start saving. If they start saving, Australia is a consumer-based economy. It's the second biggest consumer-based economy behind the US. US 70% consumer driven, Australia about 55%. So if the consumers hang up their wallets, then Australia will have its first recession since 1992. And because it's their first recession since 1992, the pain to Australia is likely to be enormous because politicians, finance workers, the man in the street, there's 2 generations of them that have turned adults over that period of time that wouldn't know what a recession was. It will be a bloodbath. But the figures from previous housing collapses are not that encouraging for Australia. So the honey of them all was Ireland. And if you really want to find out what's going to happen in New Zealand and Australia, read Michael Lewis's article, When Irish Eyes Were Crying, and then just cross out Ireland and Irish everywhere you see them and put in Kiwi and New Zealand or Australia or an Australian. They collapsed by 55%. And the household savings rate went up 8%. There's only one of these housing bubble bursts where the savings rate didn't rise, but it only fell by 0.2%. It is ironic that if you're a consumer-based economy, you need people to be spending no matter what. So, the Fed funds rate is generally considered to be a pretty good indication of what's happening to the world. So when you see interest rates slashed down to 0.25%, which is what this was, and then stay there for all those years, that means huge crash, very slow recovery. But since then, 9 increases. So clearly, there's something going on in the US. And there is. US job growth, very, very strong. This is 100 months up of job creation. 100 months. Never happened to any country anywhere in the world. Unemployment rates are the same as they were in the 60s. Neville Giles and I, some of you might remember, might know Neville, we were in the States when this happened, in the Clinton era. And it was pretty crazy. And the interesting thing is that the number of people able to have jobs because of the participation rate is now exactly where it was before the recession, less the effect of ageing. Now remember that like us, they had an 18-year baby boom from 1946 to 1964. There are 10,000 people a day turning 65 in the US. And job openings are at a record high. Never been this high. There are actually more jobs available in the US than there are unemployed people, which is extraordinary. And this is called the quits rate. Why is that important? Because people don't leave their jobs voluntarily unless they're going to a better job. That's an all-time high. And when I was in Dallas, I took that photo. If you know of anybody seeking employment, we're hiring and well trained. And the rate of wage growth in the US is 3.4%, as at the last number. 70% of CPI is wage growth. If you're quite good at maths, 0.7 times 3.4 is more than 2. And 2 is their targeted CPI rate. So, does everybody know the difference between QE and QT? No? Quantitative easing is what all the 4 big banks were doing. They were buying, it was called unconventional monetary policy. They became the buyers of bonds and debt on the market, and the reason they were doing that was to take that out of circulation so that the banks would lend and people would spend money. Quantitative tightening is when they turn around and start selling it again. The only central bank that's doing that currently is the Fed. And what this QE did was, even though the lowest interest rate that it ever got to in the US was 0.25%, the effect of the QE actually meant that they had an effective interest rate in the US of -3%. And they're now not only increasing interest rates, they're selling off the bonds that they've got. And yet this happened just the other week. The 10-year note, which did get over 3% last year, plummeted. So you've got to ask what's going on. And that brings us to capital markets. Now last year, we had this. That was the bull market that we're currently in last year. That's the longest that it had ever been, which was the 1990 to 2000 market. This is now the longest. Went through there in August last year. In the capital markets, post-Brexit, this is the S&P. Basically, equities, the only way is up. In the last 3 years, the S&P is up 35%. But in fact, it was up 35% a year ago as well. It's gone nowhere in that period of time. And it didn't really matter if you're in America or anywhere else in the world. That's the global share market performance. They look remarkably similar. But something happened in the last 6 months. This is the record. So that's the current price that is an all-time high. From there to there is minus 20.1%. Now normally if you go through 20%, you're in a bear market, but because it didn't close at that level, it only closed at 19.85% down, We're still in a bull market. If we never get back up there again, though, that's when the bull market will have finished. But the Trump and equity investors hated this. And the pressure went on the Fed because there's a question. Does the Federal Reserve kill bull markets? The evidence would seem to be yes. Every time the Fed raises interest rates, you get bear, 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 bear. And the good people, like Trump, also notice this. And this is the balance sheets of the central banks, and this is world equity performance. Notice how they follow each other. This is the effect of the Fed and its QT. And that's what happened. So they've stomped on the Fed and got them to back off, which is surprising because they're supposed to be good for economies. You've seen me talk about Swiss bond rates in the past. Nothing's changed. The blue line is zero. Every Swiss bond available out to 10 years trades at a negative interest rate. So, it's a very strong belief that this has stopped for the meantime. And we're back on the drug train. You heard Ed talk about the original philosopher, economist of the world, Adam Smith. There's another guy who was more on the dark side than was Mr. Smith. That's Karl Marx. And he talked about a thing called financialization. And financialization is when the capital markets become more important than the real economy. That's happened. So we've now got a situation where we're at an all-time high, and an all-time high by a long, long way, where of financial assets contributing, this is just household financial assets contributing to GDP in the US. And it's not just the US, although the US is the poster child. This is the change between bond and equity markets in 2008 and today. As you can see, the US, percentage of GDP, the equity markets, 2 and a bit times higher. Bond market not so great. China's much more interesting from a bond perspective, 5 times greater than it was in 2008. 5 times. But all of these, South Africa, Thailand, China, Great Britain, have grown their financial markets dramatically. When you have what Marx was warning us about 120 years, 130 years ago, was that if financial assets become the most important part of an economy, society must suffer. You must get a breakdown because you're separating people who own these financial assets from those who don't. And you can't do anything about it because the financial assets have now become such an empirical part of the economy. So now the Fed's being patient. Back in September 18, everybody thought that interest rates were going up. Now nobody does. But the problem is, history never repeats, but it does rhyme. The mustard-coloured graph is what's happened to Japanese interest rates since 1995. And mapped onto them what the other 3 central bank interest rates have done since the GFC. Look at that. We've turned Japanese. And anybody that knows anything about Japan will know that they've had 6 recessions and 4 depressions since 1990. It's not really a place we want to be. So, US job growth and wage growth is historically strong, which means inflation is likely. But the world central banks have backed off from removing their inflationary stimuli because debt is killing growth, which means inflation is now very likely, which means we will get inflation and no growth, and probably have increasing interest rates to boot. That's a wonderful thing called stagflation, which means the mountain of debt in the world will suddenly have to start getting paid for. There's no room for central banks to cut interest rates because most of them are negative, and those that aren't negative are negligible. It's very entertaining. So the central banks can kick the can down the road and attempt to keep the party alive. That's what they're trying to do at the moment. There are many threats to this. Trade wars, China rebalancing, Eurozone stability, which keeps on keeping on, credit excesses, bubbles everywhere, Brexit, housing. So tail risks, that's the chance of an explosion, are multiplying. And humans are terrible at predicting rare events. So what to do from an investment point of view? We could do what we did last year and read the Jabberwocky and take all the advice we possibly can from C.S. Lewis. Doesn't make too much sense, so maybe not. But we can remember a few things. Uncertainty can't be eliminated, but it can be mitigated. So the way that I try to do this, and this is building a pyramid the wrong way, we do have tail risk insurance, but it is insurance, it costs money. We try and build our portfolio so that we've got stuff that won't lose money and other stuff that will make money, but it's all uncorrelated as far as we can. I like to think that we do more than most people in risk assessment and economic assessment. And the margin of safety is built by true diversification. In Finance 102, it's still not different this time. The most dangerous words in finance are, this time it's different. It's never different. The New Zealand Herald publishes a review of 2018 and notes that not a single asset class produced positive returns. They should have said not a single capital markets asset class. Diversification means that you use all the tools you've got to try and make money in any situation, or at least not lose it. Last year, water made 34% in Australian dollars. Its performance since inception is over 19%. Its correlation to Australian equities is nothing. And the Sharpe ratio, which is a measure of efficiency, so you aim to have a Sharpe ratio of at least 1. That means that if you've got making at least 1 unit of return per unit of risk, you're on the right side. This thing's 3. The Global Infrastructure Trust, not a capital markets asset either. Last year, did 26% in Australian dollars. Its running return since it started is an IRR of 13%. That's if you only put in the dollar at the beginning rather than buying stuff later on. The blended IRR, if you put $1 in at the beginning and another $1 in 2010, is almost 22%. The multifamily fund we've got did almost 27% last year in US dollars. It's been running at 18.5%, and its correlation to any capital markets index anywhere is 0. So, what are we doing? We're trying to use the tried and true. Make money by not losing it in the first place. We're trying to be opportunistic. We're trying to be cynical while still being Confucian. And anybody that's been to the Forbidden Palace in in Beijing were now in one of the chapels. There's behind the throne are 2 words. And our guide said, that's the Confucian philosophy in 2 words. And I said, oh yeah, what's that? And he said, just stop. And that's what we try and do. Take nothing at face value, just stop. So, we like demography. It governs almost anything. The trend to rent, the rise of the emerging market world, the indebtedness of governments, real infrastructure. You see these things collide sometimes. The Belt and Road Initiative. 28 cities mentioned on here, one of them entertainingly called Dalsberg, almost certainly German. But of these 28 cities, all but 4 of them are emerging markets cities. And this is an infrastructure project. Importance of the middle class. This is the world-changing middle class. This is 2006. Middle class in India, essentially nothing. China, almost 2 times nothing. 2050, more than 50% of the middle class in the world are in India. And the middle class is quite important. Look at this. India, Indonesia and China, that's their current penetration of vehicles per thousand versus GDP per capita. Now China's already the biggest car market in the world. Just imagine what happens as they grow their middle class. Just imagine what happens in India. Global listed infrastructure's outperformed everything. This orange line is the S&P 500. These 3 infrastructure indices. Better than that, this is your the return of equities versus its volatility. This is the return of infrastructure versus volatility. It's higher with lower volatility. It's in the 1-2 quadrant. You don't want to be in the 2-1 quadrant. And the amazing thing is, it's a defensive asset. So in months where equity markets have fallen more than 2%, the equity markets have actually dropped an average of 4%. Infrastructure's fallen 2.5%. In months where the equity markets have gone up by more than 2%, they've averaged 4% up, but infrastructure's averaged 3%. But in sideways markets, 51 times out of 81, the infrastructure's won as well. There isn't really a perfect asset class, but if there was, it would be infrastructure. And a few other things. We've got a play on Trump, the GSE opportunities play. We've got an Australian macro fund, which is actually code for a short Australian residential fund. These are things that just aren't around all the time. We've found an Asian hedge fund we've followed for a couple of years that keeps making money in any environment. Last year, the Asia ex-Japan index fell almost 18%. This thing made 10%. And we've got what I consider to be the best risk-adjusted investment product I've ever seen, which is a loans fund that a lot of you people have heard about. So sensible, intelligent portfolio design with a sensible time frame will generate good returns. That has never changed, not even since last year when that was first written. And the next paragraph is exactly the same as last year. The easy money from the markets has been and gone. The markets look like they did in late 93, etc. Despite what happened to the capital markets then, and then this is new, and even over the last 6 months, this is an environment where you can make money. We have been here before. Any questions?